Hello and welcome to the second episode of making this pneumatic engraver. In between this episode and the last episode, there have been quite a few design tweaks. This is what it looked like in the last episode, and this is what it looks like now. As you can see, the lock nut and the sleeve have been shortened, as well as these grooves added to the sleeve for extra grip. Shortening the sleeve and lock nut allows me to make a shorter barrel if I decide to modify that later on. The handle has been made smaller and the set screw added to lock it in place. I was going to just glue the handle in place, but that would make modifying it later on much harder. The end cap probably got the largest amount of modifications. First, there is a flat machined opposite of the hose barb that the set screw and the handle will clamp onto. Because of this flat, I decided to make this diameter 3/8 of an inch instead of the original ½ inch to make sure that the set screw wouldn't dent this thin wall here. Finally, the lip was added to give the handle something to push against. Like I said before, I was originally going to glue the handle in place, but opted for more work now in the machining for easier modifications later if needed. I also decided to not buy this screw and instead make my own so that it can be as low profile as possible. The whole point in making this end cap is so that the handle can be rotated 360 degrees without changing the location of the sleeve or lock nut. There's a spring in here and the preload will be set by the sleeve location. Making this end cap means that the hose and hose barb can be moved out of the way of my hand without having to change the amount of preloading on the spring. I will first be machining the hose barb. The material I chose for this part is 1/4 inch W1 steel. This is the same steel I'll be using to make the graver collets later on, so it made sense to use the steel I already had on hand. With the steel loaded into the lathe, I will first clean up the end to get rid of the bandsaw finish. I will now apply some blue Dykem so that I can mark out the dimensions I need to turn. The smaller dimension here will be the first feature to be turned. The grooving tool might not be the best choice to do all the turning with, but this was the first time I get to use this insert, so I wanted to play around with it a little bit. With that diameter down to the final size, I can now turn the diameter for the barb part of the hose barb. I use a normal turning insert for this feature, making quick work of it. Just a little bit of cleanup and I'll be able to drill this hole down the center of the hose barb. Using a center drill, I start the hole before swapping that out for a 1/16 drill to hog out most of the material. After clearing out most of the material, I put the 1/8 inch drill bit to finish out the hole. The final feature to turn is this chamfer on the barb part of the hose barb. I could have used my compound slide, but I don't have it on the lathe right now, so a little work with files gets that chamfer close enough for what I want. The hose barb is now finished, and as you can see, everything turned out really well on this part. With the hose barb mostly complete, I can now start working on the rest of the end cap. The material I chose for this part was bronze, not only because it is easy to machine, but I also like how the metal looks. Just like with the hose barb, I first clean up the face of the bar to get rid of the bandsaw finish. The first part that will be machined is the outside diameter of the lip on the end of the end cap. There isn't a lot of material to remove since the bronze bar was just a little bit larger in diameter than that of the lip. With the outside diameter turned down to the size of the lip, I can now turn down this portion behind the lip. Switching back to the grooving tool, I do a skim pass to zero out my tool location. The width of this lip isn't critical, but I would like to make it as accurate as possible just for practice. With that skim pass now complete, I can zero out the indicator I have on the carriage before turning down the cap to the final diameter. Next, I will drill this through hole that a screw will go through later on. Starting the hole with a spot drill, I will then switch to a number 9 drill to finish out the through hole. I will be moving over to the mill next, so I am marking the location of the bar in the lathe chuck right now, so I know how to put the bar back in the lathe later on. Usually when you take the part out of the lathe and put it back, it will not be concentric to the first setup. However, in theory, I should be able to mark the location of the bar in the lathe chuck, and if I take it out and put it back in the exact same way, then both setups should be almost identical. A little bit more turning because I did not realize that I made the second diameter go far enough down the bar, and a small groove to mark the overall length in case I needed to cut this off in the bandsaw later. Taking the bar out of the lathe, I transfer it to a 5C collet block for milling. First, I'll be machining this flat that the set screw will land on later. I put the 5C collet block into the vise on the mill and make sure that the top of the collet block is lined up with the edge of my vise jaws. A few whacks with the hammer to make sure the collet block is resting on both the parallels and the end cap is now mounted in the mill. Using an edge finder, I will touch off the side and end of the cap before swapping it out for a 3/16 end mill and machining the flat to a depth of about 30 thousandths of an inch deep. Next, I'll be drilling and rimming this hole that the hose barb will go into. I swap out the R8 collet for my drill chuck and spin the 5C collet block 180 degrees, tightening the vise and giving it a few whacks to make sure the collet block is seated down all the way on the parallels. As with all my drilling operations, I first start out the hole with a center drill. To clear out a bulk of the material, I will use a 5/32 drill. Then I will finish drilling the hole with a letter C drill in preparation to ream the hole out to 0.251 inches in diameter. A quick test fit with the hose barb to make sure that it fits, and the milling work is now done. I mark out roughly the length of where I want to cut off the hose barb before going to the bandsaw and cutting it off at that length. The hose barb now slides nicely into the reamed hole, and so far everything is going to plan. To attach the hose barb to the end cap, I will solder it in place. I'm using Harris's Stay Bright Silver Solder Kit, which I love for applications like this. It has a low melting point and is really easy to work with. Putting the bar back in the lathe, I'm careful to make sure to line up the part to the Sharpie marks I made from earlier. I'm even using the same pinion to tighten the chuck as I did when I put the bar into the lathe. And all that effort has paid off. I'm seeing maybe a 1/4,000th of an inch of run out on the part. It isn't perfect, but it's close enough for this part and is a handy trick to put in the toolbox for later. Now that the part is back in the lathe, I will bore this 3/8 diameter hole. Because I want a square bottom on the hole, I decided to try something I've done before and put an end mill in the drill chuck in the tailstock of my lathe and use that to bore out this hole. Overall, this goes well, however, having the steel and the bronze was definitely a challenge. I would not recommend using this trick if you have different materials in your cut. But all is well that ends well, and the hole turned out usable, and I really like how the hose barb fits in there perfectly. Next, I used the same trick to bore out this 1/2 inch diameter hole. This also went okay, but there was a lot of chatter, so I ended up having to clean up the inside with a boring bar, which I probably should have used in the first place. I do a very small skim pass on the opening of the cap to not only touch off my grooving tool, but to also make sure that the face is perpendicular with the 1/2 inch hole I just bored. Moving the grooving tool to the final length of the cap, I start parting off the bar stock. I am stopping regularly to make sure the hose barb will not hit the tool as I am parting it off. Thankfully, there is enough clearance and the part comes off looking great. There is, however, a little bit of solder in the through hole, so I just drill that out by hand to clear the hole. Finally, a little bit of Scotch-Brite and rubberized abrasives to clean up the oxides from soldering, and now this part is complete. I'm very happy with how this part came out, and I cannot wait to see it on the finished graver. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.